Imagine a world where silence was safety and curiosity was danger, where institutions stood like cathedrals of certainty and questioning them was treated as moral betrayal, where hierarchy was not debated but inherited and obedience was mistaken for virtue. Now imagine a child born into that order who sensed before he could explain it that something in the structure was fragile, that authority depended not on truth but on performance, and that performance could be interrupted. François-Marie Arouet entered the world in 1694 in Paris, into a respectable bourgeois household governed by discipline, contracts, and measured speech. His father, a notary who believed stability came from compliance, from signatures placed carefully beneath power, from knowing one's place and remaining within it. The house was not cruel, it was structured, and structure can feel heavier than cruelty when the spirit resists it. The young boy absorbed the rituals of authority early, the polished manners, the hierarchy of voices, the way certain names were spoken with reverence while others were dismissed. And somewhere within that choreography he felt a quiet refusal forming. He was not built for confrontation, not physically imposing, not armed with noble lineage, not destined for military glory. He possessed instead a sensitivity to tone, to contradiction, to the invisible gap between what people claimed and what they practiced. He observed the world as if it were a stage. Priests preaching humility while basking in privilege. Aristocrats speaking of honor while depending on inherited status. Magistrates invoking justice while protecting rank. And he began to understand that power survives by appearing sacred. Once the sacred veneer cracks, the structure trembles. Language became his refuge and his experiment. He discovered that a sentence delivered lightly could carry more force than an accusation shouted loudly. He sensed that laughter disarms before it attacks, that mockery exposes without raising alarm until it is too late. He practiced wit the way others practiced swordplay, refining timing, studying audience reaction, learning that the smile can be both invitation and warning. In salons where conversation was currency, he learned to spend words strategically. Never reckless, always measured. At 10 years old, he was sent to the Jesuit college Louis le Grand, an institution designed to produce defenders of church and crown. There he encountered disciplined intellect, classical rhetoric, structured argument, theological certainty presented as logical inevitability. The Jesuits trained him in Latin precision, in philosophical structure, in the art of debate, and in doing so, they unknowingly handed him the tools he would later use to dismantle their authority. He watched how arguments were constructed to protect doctrine, how reason was summoned to defend revelation, how contradictions were smoothed over with elegance. And he recognized that logic itself was neutral. It could serve faith or question. He excelled, not as a submissive student, but as an agile thinker. He absorbed the mechanics of persuasion, the rhythm of classical drama, the strategic placement of emphasis within speech, and beneath the appearance of compliance he stored these techniques carefully. He was mapping the architecture of belief, identifying the joints and beams that held institutions upright. He realized that institutions do not fear force as much as they fear exposure. Ridicule transforms reverence into discomfort, and discomfort spreads quietly. As adolescence unfolded, he gravitated toward Parisian intellectual circles, toward libertine conversation, toward gatherings where cleverness signaled status. There he refined his persona, appearing charming, effortless, even frivolous. While internally he analyzed every exchange, the art of appearing harmless became essential. In an absolute monarchy, direct opposition invites punishment, but irony travels freely until it is recognized. And by then, it has already taken root. It was in this atmosphere that François-Marie Arouet began transforming into Voltaire. The name was more than stylistic choice, it was insulation. A constructed identity capable of absorbing blows that might crush a private citizen. Voltaire was maneuverable, adaptable, untethered from family expectations. In crafting this persona, he demonstrated a modern instinct, the understanding that influence depends on narrative control, that to survive in a rigid hierarchy, one must become difficult to categorize. He did not reject religion outright, nor did he immediately declare war on monarchy. His rebellion began as skepticism, as subtle misalignment with certainty. He questioned the inevitability of inherited power, the assumption that divine approval sanctified human authority, and he did so not with rage, but with measured curiosity. Curiosity itself can be destabilizing in a culture built on fixed answers within. His father's house he appeared dutiful enough, yet internally he rehearsed dissent. He read widely, wrote constantly, experimented with satire, discovering that the more serious an institution presented itself, the more vulnerable it became. To humor, solemnity demands respect, laughter withdraws it, and without respect, authority must rely on force. He understood instinctively that forcing obedience reveals insecurity. Already patterns were emerging that would define his life: tension with hierarchy, attraction to intellectual risk, awareness of reputation as shield. He was not yet the public critic of fanaticism, not yet the defender of victims in judicial scandals. But the foundations were present, a refusal to accept that tradition equals truth, a conviction that ideas deserve examination regardless of their origin. The world around him remained confident in its structure, the church secure in doctrine, the monarchy secure in divine right, the aristocracy secure in bloodline. And within that apparent solidity, a young man quietly trained himself to test each claim. He did not dream of revolution in the streets. He envisioned transformation in thought. Once minds shift, institutions must follow. In these early years, the fracture widened between obedience and autonomy, between inherited certainty and earned belief. He would not kneel simply because others did. He would not revere simply because reverence was expected. Instead, he sharpened language into instrument, developing the skill that would carry him through imprisonment, exile, controversy, and fame. The boy who once observed contracts being signed in a notary's office was preparing to challenge the unwritten contract between power and fear. Long before the Bastille, long before Ferney, long before Candide and the Colour affair, the essential decision had already been made. He would confront authority not with violence but with exposure, not with fury but with clarity, and in a society that depended on unquestioned reverence, that decision alone was revolutionary. Paris in the early 18th century moved with elegance on its surface. Carriages rolled past illuminated facades, salons shimmered with polished conversation. Courtiers navigated favor and influence with rehearsed grace. Yet beneath that refinement lay a rigid machinery of control. Words were monitored, reputations were fragile, and the state possessed a simple method for silencing inconvenience: a sealed letter, a royal signature, a door that closed without explanation. Voltaire, still young, still sharpening his reputation among the witty elite, began testing the limits of satire more openly. His verses circulated quietly at first, playful on the surface yet edged with implication. He mocked vanity, questioned competence, hinted at hypocrisy within high offices. And in a society built on image, even a suggestion could wound. Humor in an absolute monarchy is rarely interpreted as harmless, especially when it travels quickly. In 1717, he learned how thin the boundary was between cleverness and punishment, accused of composing satirical lines aimed at the regent of France. He was arrested without formal trial and taken to the Bastille. The fortress did not merely confine Baudets. It signaled disappearance. Families often received no explanation. Prisoners entered through heavy gates and emerged months or years later, altered or forgotten. The message was unmistakable. Authority did not debate dissent, it absorbed it. For Voltaire, the first sight of the stone walls was not simply fear but recognition. This was the physical manifestation of the invisible system he had been studying. Power reduced to architecture, to iron bars and locked corridors, to silence. Enforced through isolation, inside the Bastille, the theatrical rituals of court life vanished. What remained was raw hierarchy, a state confident enough to imprison without public justification. The psychological impact was decisive. Many would have retreated inward, reconsidered ambition, resolved to temper their speech. Yet confinement clarified rather than silenced. He observed the mechanics of arbitrary detention, the absence of transparency, the casual assumption that authority required no defense. And he understood something with precision. If power can imprison without explanation, it relies on fear more than legitimacy. Instead of surrendering to resentment, he turned inward to discipline. He wrote, studied, refined, using the enforced solitude as intellectual training. During those 11 months, he composed portions of what would become La Henriade, an epic poem centered on religious tolerance and civil conflict. The choice of subject was not accidental. Even within prison walls, he gravitated toward the question of fanaticism and the cost of sectarian certainty. Confinement intensified his focus rather than diluted it. The Bastille stripped illusions away, revealing that the state was neither mystical nor divinely sustained. It functioned through procedures, signatures, guards following orders. Its power was constructed, and what is constructed can be questioned. He began to see monarchy not as sacred inevitability, but as a system maintained through narrative and enforcement. Once that narrative is disrupted, enforcement must work harder. When he was released in 1718, he did not emerge humbled. He emerged sharpened. Imprisonment had granted him notoriety. Society is often fascinated by those whom authority attempts to silence. His name circulated more widely than before. The attempt to suppress him inadvertently expanded his reach. He recognized the paradox. Persecution can amplify influence when the persecuted refuses to appear broken. Yet the lesson deepened only a few years later during his conflict with Chevalier de Rohan, an aristocrat offended by Voltaire's rising reputation and sharp tongue when the nobleman mocked his name. Voltaire replied with characteristic precision, implying that merit mattered more than inherited title in a society structured around bloodline. This was more than insult. It was defiance of hierarchy itself. Rohan did not respond with argument, he responded with privilege. He arranged for Voltaire to be beaten by hired men while observing safely from a carriage. The message was unmistakable. Noble birth insulated one from consequence. Wit could wound. Pride but lineage commanded force. Voltaire sought formal redress, even proposed a duel. Yet instead of justice, he found himself arrested again. The system protected rank rather than reason. This second imprisonment carried a colder realization. As long as society privileged ancestry over intellect, reform from within would be limited. He confronted the structural imbalance directly. A commoner's logic could not easily penetrate aristocratic immunity. Humiliation clarified his position within the social hierarchy. No matter how admired his writing, he remained vulnerable to inherited power. Rather than resign himself to resentment, he made a strategic decision. Exile over silence, departure over submission. In 1726, he accepted banishment to England, a move that would prove transformative. Leaving France was not surrender, but repositioning. He understood that distance offers perspective, that observing another system allows comparison, and comparison breeds critique. The shadow of the Bastille followed him conceptually, even as he crossed the Channel. The memory of confinement, the arbitrary authority, the spectacle of privilege unchecked. These experiences formed the emotional bedrock of his later campaigns against judicial injustice and religious persecution. The fortress had shown him the cost of unchallenged power, and he resolved to spend his life testing its foundations. Prison had introduced him to the state's blunt instrument. Social humiliation had revealed aristocratic immunity. Together, these encounters dissolved any lingering belief that hierarchy corrected itself naturally. Reform would require exposure, argument, persistence, and strategic alliances. It would demand patience equal to the endurance of stone walls. In the quiet after release, he began recalibrating his approach. Satire would remain central, but precision would increase. Reckless provocation yields confinement. Disciplined critique yields influence. He learned to balance audacity with calculation, to strike in ways that maximized effect while minimizing immediate vulnerability. The Bastille had not extinguished his laughter. It had refined its timing. By the time he departed for England, he carried more than manuscripts in his luggage. He carried an altered understanding of power. He had seen its interior chambers, felt its indifference, and survived its attempt to intimidate him. Survival itself became proof that authority was not absolute, that even within stone walls the mind retains autonomy. The shadow of the Bastille did not disappear from his life. It became reference point, reminder, catalyst. Each future injustice he encountered would echo those corridors. Each legal battle would trace back to the moment he realized that silence is what sustains arbitrary rule, and if silence could be broken carefully, strategically, persistently, then even fortresses could become symbols of their own fragility. When Voltaire arrived in England in 1726, he did not simply change countries, he entered a different intellectual climate. A society still imperfect, yet structured around ideas that would reshape his understanding of power. In France, authority flowed downward from throne and altar with little public negotiation. But in London he witnessed a political culture where debate was visible, where parliament contested royal influence, where newspapers circulated argument openly, and where merchants carried social weight comparable to inherited aristocrats. The shock was not theatrical but gradual. He observed coffee houses alive with discussion, dissent voiced without immediate imprisonment, and religious communities coexisting within the same commercial spaces, and in this comparative lens he began to see France not as inevitable but as contingent, a system among other possible systems. He studied the works of John Locke and encountered a philosophy that treated government as a contract rather than a divine inheritance. The notion that legitimacy arises from consent rather than lineage resonated deeply with someone who had experienced arbitrary confinement. Locke's emphasis on natural rights and empirical reasoning offered a framework that aligned with Voltaire's instinctive skepticism toward absolute authority. And alongside philosophy, he immersed himself in the scientific revolution embodied by Isaac Newton, whose Principia demonstrated that the cosmos operates through discoverable laws rather than continuous miracles. The idea that gravity governed celestial motion with mathematical precision suggested that order need not rely on theological explanation, that nature itself could be read like a text open to disciplined inquiry. And this scientific worldview reinforced a broader principle. If the heavens function according to consistent laws, then perhaps society should aspire to similar rational coherence. He admired the English respect for Newton not merely as a scientist but as a national figure, a symbol of intellectual achievement valued publicly. And he contrasted this with France, where theological orthodoxy often overshadowed experimental thought. The coexistence of religious plurality in England impressed him as well. Anglicans, dissenters, Quakers, and even Jews participating in commercial and civic life without descending into constant violence. This relative tolerance did not mean absence of prejudice, but it illustrated the practical benefit of moderation. Sectarian diversity could coexist with stability, a realization that would later shape his advocacy for civil tolerance in France. He absorbed the English model of constitutional monarchy where the king's authority was balanced by legal constraints. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 still echoing as precedent for limiting sovereign power. And he began to understand that reform need not always emerge from violent rupture. It could evolve through institutional negotiation. During his years abroad, he also refined his command of English language and literature, engaging with Shakespeare, whose dramatic boldness contrasted sharply with French classical restraint. And although he critiqued Shakespeare's irregularities, he recognized the vitality of a culture that permitted such artistic freedom. Upon returning to France, he synthesized these observations into his letters concerning the English nation, a work that presented England as a comparative mirror, not idealized but instructive, and by highlighting English freedoms, he implicitly criticized French rigidity. The book celebrated empirical science, commercial respectability, constitutional balance, and religious tolerance, weaving admiration with strategic provocation. And predictably, the authorities in Paris perceived its implications. The letters were condemned and publicly burned, yet the act of suppression only amplified their circulation, reinforcing the lesson he had already learned in the Bastille, that censorship often confirms the potency of an idea psychologically. The English period transformed him from satirist of manners into critic of systems. He now possessed concrete examples of alternative governance, empirical philosophy, and pluralistic society. And this comparative awareness sharpened his critique of French absolutism. He no longer argued from abstraction, but from observation. Having seen that monarchy could be limited, that commerce could elevate commoners, that religious diversity need not collapse a nation, and this broadened horizon deepened his conviction that institutions are human constructs open to revision. The exile that might have silenced a lesser figure instead expanded his intellectual arsenal, equipping him with philosophical grounding and scientific respectability that would lend authority to his later campaigns. The English awakening did not turn him into a Republican revolutionary. He remained cautious about mass democracy, yet it convinced him that rational reform was both possible and necessary, that legitimacy rests on accountability, that inquiry must replace blind acceptance. And as he crossed back into France, he carried with him not nostalgia, but comparison. And comparison is one of the most destabilizing tools in political thought. Because once people see that another arrangement exists, the claim that their own arrangement is sacred becomes harder to defend. When Voltaire returned to France after the controversy of his letters, he understood that visibility without protection invited danger. And so he entered a period not of retreat, but of strategic withdrawal, finding refuge at the Château de Cirey, the estate of Émilie du Châtelet, a woman whose intellect equaled and in many respects disciplined his own. Cirey was not merely a romantic sanctuary, but an intellectual workshop, a place where speculation met calculation, where poetry encountered physics, and where Voltaire's restless energy was forced into rigor by a mind trained in mathematics and natural philosophy. Émilie was fluent in Newtonian science at a level few in France could claim, translating and interpreting complex equations with precision. And in her presence, Voltaire's brilliance could not rely solely on wit. She demanded accuracy, demanded comprehension beyond metaphor, and this partnership reshaped him profoundly. Together, they constructed a private academy within the walls of the chateau, filling rooms with scientific instruments, books, telescopes, manuscripts, turning provincial quiet into a center of Enlightenment inquiry. Here Voltaire deepened his engagement with Newton's laws, not as distant admiration but as structured study, recognizing that science offered more than knowledge of motion and gravity. It offered a model for thinking, observation first, hypothesis tested, conclusion provisional. A method that stood in sharp contrast to theological certainty declared without experiment. Under Émilie's influence, he refined his elements of Newton's philosophy, presenting complex scientific ideas in accessible prose so that it educated readers outside academic circles could grasp their implications. This act was both pedagogical and political, because to explain nature as lawful and intelligible subtly weakened the authority of those who claimed monopoly over cosmic explanation. The laboratory at Cirey thus became symbolic, a microcosm of the new intellectual order where reason collaborated rather than obeyed, where knowledge was pursued for clarity rather than control. Yet this period was not devoid of tension. Voltaire's temperament remained theatrical and ambitious, craving recognition and impact, while Cirey required patience, calculations repeated, experiments verified, drafts revised, and through this discipline he matured, learning that the demolition of superstition requires more than sarcasm. It requires evidence, structure, coherence. Émilie's presence also anchored him emotionally, providing companionship that balanced his volatility. She did not idolize him. She debated him, corrected him, challenged his oversimplifications, and in that friction his thought gained depth. Their evenings blended discussion of metaphysics with analysis of mechanics, reflections on morality alongside measurements of energy, demonstrating that enlightenment was not merely attack on dogma, but construction of alternative understanding. Cirey also offered him temporary insulation from court politics and aristocratic humiliation, allowing him to rebuild reputation on intellectual rather than social foundations. Visitors who arrived encountered not a disgraced satirist, but a disciplined thinker immersed in science and philosophy, and gradually his image shifted, from controversial wit to serious contributor to modern thought. Yet beneath the calm productivity lay awareness that external France had not transformed. Censorship persisted, privilege endured, and the laboratory remained island rather than nation. This duality sharpened his long-term strategy. He recognized that reform requires both critique and demonstration. One must show not only what is flawed, but what is possible. And Cirey embodied possibility. A collaborative, intellectual space outside direct clerical control, where inquiry operated freely. When Emily undertook her monumental translation of Newton's Principia into French, adding commentary that clarified and expanded upon the original, Voltaire witnessed scholarship at its highest discipline, and her work would become foundational for Newtonian science in France, reinforcing the idea that progress depended on meticulous labor rather than rhetorical flourish. This recognition humbled him in productive ways, teaching that enlightenment required builders as well as critics. And as years passed within the chateau walls, he integrated scientific respectability into his broader campaign for tolerance and rational governance. Understanding that arguments grounded in observable reality carried durability beyond satire alone, the laboratory thus refined his arsenal, tempering laughter with learning, irony with insight, and when tragedy struck with Emily's death in 1749, the loss fractured more than companionship. It removed the stabilizing force that had balanced his ambition with discipline, leaving him intellectually equipped yet emotionally unmoored. And from that grief emerged a sharper urgency, a sense that time was finite and injustice persistent. That reflection must give way again to engagement. And so the years at Cirey stand as transformation, the forging of Voltaire not merely as critic of old structures, but as advocate for a worldview grounded in reason, evidence, and collaborative inquiry. Principles that would guide his next encounters with courts, kings, and the wider public sphere. After the disciplined years at Cirey and the stabilizing presence of Emily, Voltaire found himself once again drawn toward the gravitational pull of power. This time, not as a satirist probing from the margins, but as an invited guest at the center of monarchy, Frederick the Great of Prussia, a ruler who prided himself on intellect as much as military ambition, extended an invitation that seemed to promise a rare experiment, a throne aligned with philosophy, a crown willing to listen, to reason. And for a man who had spent decades critiquing authority from distance, the possibility was intoxicating. Perhaps reform could move not only from below through public opinion, but from above through enlightened command. Perhaps a king could be persuaded to embody the rational contract he had long imagined. When Voltaire arrived at Sanssouci in 1750, he entered a court designed to signal refinement. Music drifting through halls, poetry discussed between strategic briefings, conversations framed in the language of progress. Frederick admired French culture, corresponded in polished prose, and cultivated the image of sovereign thinker. And initially, the arrangement appeared mutually beneficial. The king gained prestige by hosting Europe's most famous critic of fanaticism. Voltaire gained proximity to influence that might accelerate reform. It seemed a convergence of intellect and authority, a stage upon which philosophy could guide policy, yet beneath ceremonial civility, tension accumulated quietly. Frederick valued brilliance, but expected deference. He enjoyed debate, yet remained conscious of hierarchy, and Voltaire, despite strategic instincts, struggled to perform the role of ornamental advisor. He had not spent years refining independence, only to become decorative. Conversations that began as stimulating exchanges gradually revealed underlying asymmetry. The king commanded armies, signed decrees, decided wars, and even when he entertained philosophical critique, he did so within boundaries he defined. Voltaire began to sense the limits of enlightened absolutism. A ruler may appreciate reason, yet still preserve prerogative. The friction deepened when Voltaire's satirical impulse resurfaced in ways that unsettled the court. He engaged in disputes with other intellectuals under royal protection, and when he published a sharp critique aimed at one of Frederick's favored associates, the king perceived it not as principled analysis but as personal embarrassment. In monarchic systems, loyalty often outweighs logic, and Voltaire's instinct to expose folly clashed with the expectations of a sovereign accustomed to control. The atmosphere shifted from admiration to irritation, from collaboration to containment. Psychologically, this period forced Voltaire to confront a difficult truth: power and philosophy rarely merge seamlessly. Even a cultivated monarch remains invested in authority's preservation. The very structure of kingship resists complete transparency, and Voltaire, who had once imagined guiding a ruler toward rational governance, realized that influence within court walls required compromise he was unwilling to sustain. The philosopher king revealed himself to be first and foremost a king, strategic, ambitious, sensitive to prestige. And while Frederick continued to admire intellectual exchange, he did not relinquish control over narrative or decision. The disillusionment sharpened into rupture, tensions escalated, correspondence cooled, and eventually Voltaire departed in 1753. But departure was not smooth. He was detained at the border, questioned, pressured over manuscripts and financial disputes, a reminder that even enlightened courts maintain instruments of coercion. The golden refuge had revealed iron beneath its polish, and the experience extinguished any remaining hope that systemic reform could rely solely on benevolent rulers. Leaving Prussia marked a decisive pivot. Voltaire's belief in enlightened absolutism weakened, replaced by renewed faith in dispersed influence, in public opinion, in networks of correspondence rather than singular patrons. He concluded that kings may adopt enlightened language, yet remain constrained by power's imperatives, and that lasting change must anchor itself beyond the whims of individual rulers. The illusion of philosopher king dissolved into pragmatic realism, reinforcing lessons first learned in the Bastille. Authority without accountability retains capacity for arbitrary action regardless of intellectual decoration. Yet the episode was not wasted. It granted insight into the psychology of governance, the insecurities and calculations beneath royal posture, the balancing act between image and control. And this knowledge would inform his later campaigns, enabling him to navigate correspondence with sovereigns more strategically, to praise when useful, to critique indirectly when necessary, to leverage reputation without surrendering autonomy. He emerged from Sun Tzu less enchanted but more seasoned, convinced that while rulers might occasionally assist reform, they could not be its foundation. In retrospect, the court of Frederick functioned as final test of Voltaire's optimism regarding top-down transformation. He had entered imagining accelerator through proximity. He left recognizing that genuine liberty cannot depend on singular goodwill. It requires structures that outlive personalities, laws that constrain power consistently, citizens capable of independent thought. And from this, recognition would grow his most sustained period of influence, not within palaces, but at the border of them, where ideas circulate more freely than commands, where distance provides leverage, and where the cultivation of reason could proceed without waiting for a crown's approval. After the collapse of his experiment with Frederick and the final erosion of faith in enlightened absolutism, Voltaire chose neither obscurity nor reckless confrontation. Instead, he engineered something far more strategic. In 1758, he purchased an estate at Ferney, a quiet village positioned deliberately on the border between France and Geneva. And this geographical choice was not incidental. It was calculated autonomy, a residence that allowed escape within steps. If French authorities pressed too closely, he could cross into Swiss territory. If Genevan officials objected, he could return to France. Ferney became not retreat but leverage, a physical manifestation of independence. The estate itself was transformed under his direction. He invested heavily in construction, agriculture, industry, inviting watchmakers, silk workers, and craftsmen to settle there, building homes, improving infrastructure, stimulating local economy. And in doing so, he crafted more than personal refuge. He created a functioning model of practical enlightenment. Governance at small scale where productivity replaced privilege, where merit mattered more than lineage, and where reason guided decision rather than inherited ceremony. He did not hold official title as ruler, yet within Ferney his authority derived from initiative and intellect rather than blood. From this border sanctuary he launched what would become his most influential phase. Thousands of letters flowing outward across Europe, correspondence with monarchs, philosophers, jurists, reformers, scientists, artists, the volume astonishing, the range expansive. And through this network, he constructed what he once envisioned. Abstractly, a republic of letters operating above territorial boundaries. Ideas crossing frontiers more easily than armies. His desk became command center of intellectual diplomacy. Messages crafted carefully, praise extended strategically, critique delivered with calibrated force. Ferney allowed him to control his environment while expanding influence globally. Freed from daily court intrigue, he concentrated on cases of injustice that demanded exposure, religious persecution, judicial cruelty, intolerance disguised as piety. And it was here that the Calar affair would draw him into direct confrontation with the machinery of fanaticism. Yet before that storm erupted, he had already refined a new posture. Less dependent on singular patronage, more reliant on public persuasion. He understood now that sustainable reform grows through awareness, not decree. The psychological shift at Ferney was profound. Earlier in life, he had reacted to insult or confinement with sharpened wit. Now, he adopted patience, persistence, financial support for victims, methodical gathering of evidence. He recognized that indignation must be channeled through process, that outrage alone dissipates unless organized. And so Ferney functioned as a laboratory of civic engagement, where strategy replaced impulse, and where his wealth, accumulated through careful investments and publishing success, funded legal interventions and pamphlet campaigns. He also cultivated image deliberately. The hermit of Ferney, frail yet alert, pen in hand, portraits circulated widely, reinforcing his identity as elder statesman of reason. This branding was not vanity alone, but protection. Fame complicates persecution. Authorities hesitate before silencing figures admired internationally. And Voltaire leveraged celebrity as shield, transforming personal reputation into structural advantage. Yet Ferney was not insulated from conflict. Local disputes arose. Genevan clergy criticized his theatre productions, and religious heterodoxy. Tensions surfaced between ideals and practical governance. And in navigating these frictions, he demonstrated adaptability, negotiating when useful, standing firm when necessary, illustrating that enlightenment required diplomacy as much as defiance. His village was no utopia, but an embodied effort toward rational coexistence. The position on the border symbolized his broader philosophy. Liberty exists in spaces between rigid systems, and those spaces must be cultivated intentionally. He oversaw economic development by day and composed arguments against injustice by night, blending material progress with intellectual activism. Recognizing that prosperity and freedom reinforce one another, a hungry population struggles to engage in abstract debate. So he linked economic stability with civic dignity by the time he entered his 60s and 70s. Ferney had become pilgrimage site for visitors seeking conversation with the most famous writer in Europe. Diplomats, young thinkers, curious travelers arriving to witness the man who had survived prisons, courts, scandals, and still wielded influence, and he received them with theatrical hospitality tempered by calculation. Every encounter another opportunity to disseminate skepticism toward fanaticism and support for legal reform. The sovereign of Ferney held no crown, yet commanded attention across continents. His authority rooted in intellect and persistence rather than decree, and in this phase he approached the height of his impact, no longer seeking validation from monarchs, but positioning himself as conscience external to them, a voice capable of praising moderation while condemning cruelty, independent enough to criticize, influential enough to matter. Ferney represented culmination of lessons learned through decades of conflict. That safety requires strategy, that influence multiplies through networks, that reform demands both visibility and insulation. And within its borders, Voltaire refined the model of engaged intellectual, neither isolated scholar nor court-dependent advisor, but autonomous actor shaping discourse from calculated distance, preparing for the battles that would soon define his legacy and solidify his place, not merely as critic of institutions, but as defender of human dignity. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, as churches in Lisbon filled with worshippers celebrating All Saints' Day, the earth began to convulse beneath their feet. Buildings fractured, cathedrals collapsed, fires spread through shattered streets, and within hours, one of Europe's most devout cities had become a landscape of smoke, rubble, and bodies. Tens of thousands perished, many crushed beneath sacred stone, others consumed by flames that followed the tremors. And across the continent, theologians rushed to interpret the catastrophe, some calling it divine punishment, others insisting it was part of a mysterious providential plan. But for Voltaire, watching from Ferney, the disaster was not a sermon, it was an indictment. An event so brutal and indifferent that it shattered the comfortable optimism popular among certain philosophers who claimed that this world, with all its suffering, must still be the best of all possible worlds. He saw in the ruins of Lisbon a confrontation between human pain and abstract reassurance, and he could not accept explanations that sanctified devastation as necessary harmony. The earthquake intensified doubts that had long been forming within him about the notion of benevolent intervention governing daily life. If a just and attentive deity orchestrated events, why would devotion offer no protection? Why would innocent children be buried alongside criminals? Why would faith itself become a death trap? These were not rhetorical flourishes, but moral questions sharpened by grief and outrage. And in response, he composed his poem on the Lisbon disaster, a work that challenged complacent metaphysics and demanded acknowledgement of suffering without euphemism. He rejected the insistence that everything must ultimately resolve into cosmic perfection, arguing instead that human beings must confront tragedy honestly, without retreating into comforting abstraction. The poem was not atheistic fury, but moral protest, a refusal to allow theology to anesthetize empathy. And through it, he articulated a shift in Enlightenment thought from speculative optimism towards sober realism. He maintained belief in a rational creator, but stripped that creator of constant intervention, proposing instead a universe governed by natural laws indifferent to individual fate. This perspective did not eliminate faith, but transformed it into deism, a conception of divinity as architect rather than micromanager. And in that transformation, responsibility migrated decisively toward humanity. If earthquakes follow geological forces rather than divine moods, then relief and reconstruction become human obligations rather than prayers for mercy. The Lisbon catastrophe thus accelerated Voltaire's campaign against fatalism, reinforcing his conviction that passively accepting misery as providential undermines moral progress. He sharpened his satire against those who trivialize suffering with polished syllogisms, and this intellectual battle would find its most famous expression in Candide, where naive optimism collapses under relentless misfortune, yet beneath the humor lay genuine anguish. The recognition that philosophy detached from lived reality risks cruelty of its own. Lisbon forced Europe to reconsider the relationship between nature, God, and human agency. And for Voltaire, it confirmed that doubt was not corrosive nihilism, but ethical necessity. Questioning inherited explanations became act of compassion. Refusing to glorify disaster as hidden blessing became defense of the vulnerable. And from that rubble, he drew a clearer line between reason and resignation, insisting that if the world contains chaos and pain, then progress depends not on justifying it, but on mitigating it. The earthquake did not extinguish belief, but recalibrated it, replacing unquestioned optimism with vigilant responsibility. And in doing so, it propelled Voltaire further toward his enduring mission, to challenge narratives that sanctify suffering and to advocate instead for practical action, legal reform, tolerance, and solidarity grounded not in promises of heavenly compensation but in commitment to earthly justice. By the early 1760s, Voltaire's skepticism had hardened into resolve. The Lisbon earthquake had stripped away philosophical optimism and replaced it with moral urgency, and from his estate at Ferney he began focusing not only on abstract arguments but on concrete injustices, coining a phrase that would echo through his correspondence and publications: écrasez l'infâme, crush the infamous, by which he meant not faith itself but institutionalized fanaticism, the machinery of persecution that fused religious certainty with judicial cruelty. And in 1762 that machinery revealed its brutality in the case of Jean Collard, a Protestant merchant in Toulouse accused of murdering his own son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Despite weak evidence and testimony distorted by sectarian prejudice, Collard was arrested, tortured on the breaking wheel, every bone shattered methodically, and executed while proclaiming innocence. The spectacle was intended as warning, proof that deviation from orthodoxy would not be tolerated. But when news reached Voltaire, it ignited something deeper than outrage. He recognized in Collard not merely a victim, but a symbol, a demonstration of how certainty without tolerance corrodes justice, and he resolved that silence would make him complicit. He began by gathering facts with disciplined care, corresponding with witnesses, studying trial records, identifying inconsistencies, because he understood that moral indignation alone could be dismissed as bias. But evidence, combined with public argument, could destabilize a verdict, he wrote. Pamphlets dissecting the case with clarity and persistence, transforming a local tragedy into international controversy, leveraging his vast network of correspondence to circulate details across Europe, shifting the trial from provincial secrecy into continental scrutiny. And as pressure mounted, authorities found it increasingly difficult to ignore discrepancies. Voltaire framed the affair not as isolated error, but as consequence of intolerance embedded within legal structures, insisting that justice must operate independent of confessional identity, that a Protestant or Catholic accused of crime deserves equal protection under law. His campaign lasted years, sustained by letters, essays, financial support for the Carla family, and relentless refusal to allow memory of the execution to fade. And in 1765 the verdict was finally overturned. Carla declared innocent posthumously, his family compensated. The decision marking unprecedented triumph of public opinion over judicial rigidity. This victory did more than restore a name. It demonstrated that coordinated intellectual pressure could correct institutional injustice, emboldening Voltaire to intervene in additional cases, such as those of Savine and Labarre, each reinforcing his belief that the law must serve evidence rather than dogma. From Ferney he functioned as an official advocate for victims whose voices had been crushed by prejudice. And through these campaigns he shifted Enlightenment discourse from salons into courtrooms, translating philosophical principles into legal. Reform, écrasez from, thus evolved from slogan into strategy, targeting not belief but coercion, not spirituality but brutality, justified in its name. And critics accused him of exaggeration or destabilization, yet he maintained that exposing cruelty strengthens rather than weakens society, that tolerance preserves order more effectively than repression. The war against the infamous was not dramatic uprising, but patient erosion. One case at a time, one pamphlet at a time, dismantling assumption that authority is beyond question. And in waging this campaign, Voltaire solidified transformation from satirist to moral advocate, proving that reason, armed with persistence, can challenge even entrenched systems, that a pen, when guided by evidence and amplified through networks, can reshape verdicts once deemed irreversible. And through these battles he redefined the role of intellectual in public life, not detached commentator, but engaged defender of human dignity, using reputation not for applause but for protection of those denied it. By 1764, Voltaire understood that influence required accessibility, that vast encyclopedic volumes, though admirable, were often too expensive and too dense for the ordinary reader. And so he conceived a different instrument, compact, portable, deceptively simple. The philosophical dictionary, arranged alphabetically so that dangerous ideas could hide beneath familiar headings. Each entry brief yet incisive, examining concepts such as tolerance, tyranny, miracle, prophecy, soul, and superstition with a clarity that stripped away inherited reverence. The format itself was strategic. A reader could open to any page without committing to systematic study, absorbing arguments in small, concentrated doses, and in this design Voltaire democratized skepticism, transforming doubt into something practical rather than academic. Each article functioned like a controlled detonation, not explosive in noise, but in implication, inviting readers to reconsider assumptions long accepted without scrutiny. He analyzed biblical narratives as historical documents rather than sacred certainties, pointed out contradictions between proclaimed mercy and recorded violence, highlighted the human origins of doctrines presented as divine inevitabilities, and he did so with measured irony rather than furious denunciation, allowing readers to reach conclusions through guided reflection rather than coercion. The dictionary circulated quickly despite official condemnation. Authorities in Paris and Geneva ordered copies burned, yet suppression only intensified curiosity. Clandestine printers reproduced editions across borders, smuggling them through networks that had grown around Enlightenment correspondence, and Voltaire observed with restrained satisfaction that censorship functioned as advertisement. A banned book acquires aura of forbidden truth, encouraging those who might otherwise ignore it to seek it out. Psychologically, the work represented culmination of decades spent refining language into precision instrument, no longer dependent solely on theatrical satire or lengthy epics. He had mastered the art of concentrated critique, compressing complex debates into accessible prose that could be read aloud in salons or discussed in marketplaces. The dictionary also symbolized shift from solitary author to collective movement, its arguments resonating with contemporaries such as Diderot and D'Alembert, who were compiling the encyclopedia. And although differences emerged between Voltaire's cautious deism and the more radical materialism of some younger thinkers, they shared commitment to dismantling intellectual monopolies. The philosophical dictionary did not attempt to construct a comprehensive system. It sought instead to erode unquestioned authority entry by entry, redefining sacredness as openness to examination, encouraging readers to treat inherited beliefs not as untouchable relics, but as hypotheses subject to reason. Critics accused him of irreverence bordering on impiety, yet he defended his method as pursuit of clarity, insisting that truth withstands scrutiny while falsehood depends on insulation. And as editions multiplied across Europe, the dictionary became emblem of portable enlightenment. A handbook for intellectual self-defense, small enough to conceal, sharp enough to challenge, proving that the architecture of doubt need not be monumental to be transformative. Sometimes it fits in the palm of a hand, traveling quietly from reader to reader, altering perspectives one reflection at a time from the quiet command center of Ferney. Voltaire expanded his influence not through official office, but through correspondence that stretched across continents. Thousands of letters written in steady succession, addressed to monarchs, ministers, philosophers, scientists, playwrights, jurists, reformers, young admirers seeking guidance, and seasoned thinkers testing arguments. This vast network became what he and others described as a republic of letters, a community not defined by territory but by exchange, where ideas crossed borders more freely than armies, and where reputation functioned as currency. Each letter carefully calibrated, sometimes flattering to secure access, sometimes incisive to provoke reconsideration, always strategic in tone. He understood that persuasion travels most effectively when it feels personal, a private message. Read aloud in a salon carries intimacy that a printed manifesto cannot replicate. And so he cultivated relationships that turned even rulers into reluctant conduits of Enlightenment discourse. In this republic, authority derived not from lineage, but from intellect, a principle that quietly undermined aristocratic hierarchy. A scholar in Berlin could debate a poet in Paris. A scientist in London could influence conversation in Geneva. And Voltaire positioned himself as central node within this circulation, amplifying certain voices, moderating others. Encouraging collaboration while maintaining autonomy, he praised Catherine the Great of Russia as potential reformer. Engaging her in discussions of legal modernization and religious tolerance. Yet even in praise he preserved caution, aware that rulers often adopt enlightened language while preserving imperial ambition. His diplomacy balanced idealism with realism, offering endorsement when it advanced reform, withdrawing warmth when it risked complicity. The Republic of Letters also served protective function. Visibility within an international network complicated local suppression to imprison or silence. Voltaire outright risked diplomatic embarrassment, and he leveraged this awareness effectively, ensuring that controversies surrounding him rarely remained confined to provincial jurisdictions. When adversaries attacked his credibility, he responded not only with pamphlets, but with letters that reframed disputes as philosophical rather than personal, elevating feuds into debates about reason and justice, thus securing broader audience sympathy. Yet this intellectual commonwealth was not harmonious utopia. Disagreements simmered, particularly between Voltaire and younger encyclopedists, whose drift toward materialism and atheism unsettled his deist conviction that moral order required acknowledgement of rational creator. Correspondence with Rousseau deteriorated into rivalry, revealing fractures within Enlightenment itself. Tension between structured reason and emotive authenticity, between reformist moderation and radical reconstruction. And through these exchanges, Voltaire refined his role not as revolutionary demolisher, but as stabilizing critic, wary that excessive zeal might replace one dogma with another. The scale of his epistolary output remains staggering. Letters composed rapidly, yet rarely carelessly, weaving humor with argument, personal anecdote with philosophical reflection, and through repetition of themes, tolerance, legal reform, empirical inquiry, he reinforced a shared vocabulary among correspondents, constructing coherence without central authority. The Republic functioned because participants valued exchange over obedience, critique over conformity, and in this decentralized model Voltaire glimpsed alternative to hierarchical control, a society bound by conversation rather than command. As years progressed, the network extended beyond Europe, influencing thinkers in the American colonies who cited his defense of free expression and critique of religious coercion as intellectual scaffolding for their own constitutional experiments. And though Voltaire never crossed the Atlantic, his ideas did, traveling through translations and citations that linked Enlightenment discourse with emerging republicanism, demonstrating that the Republic of Letters could prefigure political transformation, discourse preceding institution ultimately. This phase solidified Voltaire's transformation from solitary satirist into architect of communication, recognizing that sustained change requires collective articulation, that arguments repeated across regions acquired durability beyond single publication. And in nurturing this web of exchange, he ensured that even after his death, ideas associated with his name would persist, circulating independently of his physical presence. The Republic of Letters thus became both method and legacy, a living demonstration that when minds connect across boundaries, authority loses monopoly over truth, and dialogue itself becomes quiet engine of reform. As the Enlightenment matured and its influence widened, unity among its thinkers began to strain under the weight of diverging visions. What had once appeared as collective movement against superstition, an absolutism gradually revealed internal fault lines. And at the center of one of the most consequential fractures stood the rivalry between Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Two men committed to dismantling the old order, yet profoundly divided over what should replace it. Voltaire believed in refinement, in progress through science, commerce, and cultivated reason. He trusted institutions could be corrected and moderated, that civilization, despite its flaws, elevated human potential. Rousseau, on the other hand, questioned whether civilization itself corrupted natural virtue, arguing that society imposed artificial hierarchies that distorted authenticity and compassion. Where Voltaire saw salons as engines of discourse, Rousseau saw them as theatres of vanity. Where Voltaire praised constitutional balance, Rousseau warned that inequality embedded within structures would inevitably betray liberty. Their conflict unfolded not only in published works, but in letters and public exchanges that exposed philosophical tension to broader audiences. Voltaire mocked Rousseau's romantic primitivism, suggesting that longing for pre-civilized innocence ignored practical realities of governance and cooperation. He famously alluded to Rousseau's abandonment of his own children to an orphanage as contradiction within his moral rhetoric. Rousseau in turn accused Voltaire of eroding faith and unsettling social bonds, labeling him high priest of irreverence whose skepticism threatened moral cohesion. Beneath the personal barbs lay deeper ideological divergence. Voltaire feared emotional absolutism as much as theological dogma. He distrusted appeals to collective will untethered from rational safeguards, suspecting that passion elevated above procedure could mutate into tyranny under new banner. This fracture signaled transformation within Enlightenment itself. From unified opposition to clerical and aristocratic authority, into debate over foundations of modernity, reform versus reinvention, measured liberalism versus radical democracy, and Voltaire positioned himself as guardian of moderation, supportive of legal equality and freedom of conscience, yet cautious about dismantling hierarchical structures entirely. He preferred gradual adjustment to sweeping revolution, believing that instability invites backlash and chaos. His skepticism extended even toward movements aligned nominally with liberty if they lacked institutional restraint. The divergence between him and Rousseau would later echo ominously during the French Revolution, where rhetoric of general will sometimes justified suppression in name of unity, reinforcing Voltaire's anxiety that ideals untethered from rational boundaries risked replicating intolerance under new ideology. Yet despite hostility, both men contributed indispensably to erosion of Onzian regime authority. Voltaire weakening reverence for church and crown through ridicule and argument. Rousseau stirring emotional demand for sovereignty and equality. Their tension illustrating that intellectual revolutions rarely proceed along single path within this contested terrain. Voltaire continued advocating tolerance and legal reform, wary that radical zeal might displace one orthodoxy with another. He emphasized the importance of protecting dissent, even from those claiming to speak for people collectively, insisting that liberty of thought must survive beyond immediate political victories. The fracture of the Enlightenment thus sharpened his awareness that ideas possess unpredictable trajectories, that dismantling inherited structures opens space for competing blueprints, and that responsibility of critic extends beyond destruction to vigilance over reconstruction. In confronting Rousseau's influence, Voltaire recognized, perhaps for the first time, that the greatest threat to reason might not arise from cathedral or palace, but from within movements, born to challenge them, and this realization deepened complexity of his legacy, casting him not simply as enemy of old regime but as cautious architect of modern pluralism. advocating balance between skepticism and stability, between reform and restraint, determined that the light of reason should illuminate, without consuming the fragile structures that allow society to endure. The tension between Voltaire and Rousseau did not remain abstract disagreement confined to philosophical nuance. It evolved into one of the defining intellectual rivalries of the 18th century. A clash not merely of arguments, but of temperaments, backgrounds, and visions of humanity's future. Voltaire, the urbane master of salons, comfortable among elites, yet critical of their excesses. Rousseau, the restless outsider, suspicious of refinement. Convinced that authenticity had been sacrificed to artifice, their conflict intensified after Rousseau sent Voltaire a copy of his discourse on the origin of inequality, a work arguing that civilization itself had corrupted natural goodness. And Voltaire's response carried characteristic irony, thanking him for the book, while remarking that it made one feel like walking on all fours again. The comment encapsulated his skepticism toward nostalgia for pre-civilized simplicity. For Voltaire, progress meant accumulation of knowledge, expansion of commerce, improvement of law. He believed that science reduced suffering, that literacy broadened opportunity, that urban conversation refined moral awareness, Rousseau countered. That these very developments entrenched inequality, creating dependency and vanity, substituting performance for sincerity. Where Voltaire trusted institutions could be rationalized, Rousseau doubted their moral foundation entirely, advocating social contract rooted in collective sovereignty, and beneath their exchange lay deeper anxiety about human nature. Voltaire, wary of unchecked emotion shaping political destiny, Rousseau convinced that reason detached from feeling produced cold injustice. The rivalry intensified as Rousseau's popularity grew among readers disillusioned with aristocratic culture. His celebration of sentiment resonating in ways Voltaire's urbane wit did not, and Voltaire perceived within this rising admiration a potential volatility. He feared that romanticizing the general will without procedural safeguards might sanction coercion in name of unity. That moral fervor could mutate into intolerance toward dissent, and though he defended freedom of expression broadly, he did not hesitate to ridicule Rousseau's perceived inconsistencies, exposing contradictions between professed ideals and personal conduct. Yet this criticism was not purely personal antagonism. It reflected genuine divergence over trajectory of modern society. Rousseau's eventual persecution and exile from various cities complicated matters, forcing Voltaire into paradoxical position. Defending liberty of a thinker, he criticized sharply, illustrating commitment to principle above rivalry. And in private correspondence, Voltaire occasionally softened tone, acknowledging that disagreement did not negate shared opposition to dogmatic oppression. Nevertheless, the fracture remained emblematic of Enlightenment's internal debate, rational liberalism confronting emotive democracy, skepticism toward inherited authority intersecting with suspicion of emerging collectivism. Their conflict would echo beyond their lifetimes, influencing revolutionary discourse and shaping competing interpretations of freedom. Voltaire's caution about concentrated passion contrasted with Rousseau's faith in communal virtue, and history would test both visions with sobering consequences. Yet within their rivalry, one observes vitality of intellectual culture, unafraid of contention. The Enlightenment was not monolithic doctrine, but arena of vigorous dispute, and Voltaire's engagement with Rousseau sharpened his articulation of moderate reform, reinforcing his insistence that liberty must coexist with tolerance and procedural justice. In the end, their names would be enshrined together in the Pantheon, buried across from one another as twin architects of transformation they experienced. So differently, a silent testament to complexity of ideas that dismantled an old world while disagreeing profoundly about the new one. And in this rivalry, Voltaire's identity crystallized further. Not revolutionary prophet of pure democracy, but guardian of measured skepticism, advocating change disciplined by reason, wary that in overthrowing tyranny humanity must not enthrone another in its place. Voltaire's most enduring weapon was neither formal treatise nor royal alliance, but satire, a disciplined craft he refined across decades until it functioned as both shield and blade. He understood that people defend beliefs fiercely when confronted directly, yet laughter slips past defenses, dissolving reverence before resistance can organize. Satire reduces the untouchable to proportion. It shrinks grandeur into absurdity, and in doing so, it alters psychological hierarchy. A king mocked ceases to appear divine. A dogma, examined humorously, begins to tremble. Voltaire grasped this mechanism intuitively, recognizing that ridicule can destabilize what argument alone cannot penetrate. In Candide, he demonstrated satire at full power, constructing a narrative that follows naive optimism through a landscape of war, disaster, betrayal, and hypocrisy, each calamity exposing the fragility of philosophical assurances that all unfolds. For the best, the tone remained deceptively light, sentences brisk, misfortunes almost surreal in their accumulation. Yet beneath the wit lay indictment of complacency. He did not preach despair, but demanded realism, insisting that moral responsibility begins when illusions dissolve, and the famous closing exhortation to cultivate one's garden carried layered meaning, urging practical action over speculative metaphysics, steady labor over grand declarations. Satire for Voltaire required calibration. Too subtle and it vanished into polite amusement, too harsh and it provoked immediate repression. He balanced irony with clarity, ensuring readers perceived target without mistaking intent, often disguising critique within fictional settings or historical allegory, allowing plausible deniability while guiding audience toward recognition. This technique protected him from outright condemnation while expanding interpretive engagement. Readers felt complicit in discovery, arriving at conclusions seemingly on their own, which strengthened persuasion. Beyond novels, he applied satirical precision to pamphlets and shorter essays, responding rapidly to events with concise commentary, compressing complex debates into memorable phrases that circulated icily. He anticipated modern media rhythms, understanding that brief, pointed arguments travel further than exhaustive dissertations, and through repetition of motifs, fanaticism, hypocrisy, arbitrary power, he constructed coherent critique accessible to varied audiences, from aristocrats in salons to merchants and professionals seeking clarity amid doctrinal noise. The architecture of his satire rested on moral foundation. He did not mock suffering itself, but those who justified it. He targeted structures that shielded cruelty behind sanctity, and by doing so he maintained ethical center even while employing humor. Critics accused him of cynicism. Yet his laughter aimed not at human vulnerability, but at institutional arrogance. He sought to liberate minds from fear rather than deepen despair. And this distinction preserved his influence across ideological divides. The stage also became arena for satirical strategy, his plays embedding philosophical tensions within dramatic conflict, inviting audiences to witness consequences of intolerance enacted before them. Theatre allowed emotional engagement alongside intellectual reflection, blending entertainment with education in ways that circumvented censorship more effectively than direct polemic. Applause masked subversion, and characters debating honor or revenge subtly mirrored contemporary anxieties about authority and justice. Over time, satire shaped not only his output but his identity. The public came to associate Voltaire with incisive wit, capable of dismantling pretense in a sentence, and this reputation amplified his campaigns. Opponents, aware that confrontation might transform them into caricature, hesitated before provoking him. Laughter became deterrent, reinforcing his strategic position within intellectual landscape. Yet satire also carried risk. Perpetual irony can erode trust if misapplied, and Voltaire navigated this boundary by pairing humor with advocacy, ensuring that behind the grin stood commitment to tolerance and legal reform. His architecture of satire thus combined entertainment with ethical purpose, revealing that dismantling reverence is not act of destruction alone but prerequisite for reconstruction. Once illusions fall, society can rebuild on sturdier ground. And in mastering this art, Voltaire secured legacy not merely as critic, but as craftsman of intellectual liberation. As Voltaire aged and his influence solidified, his attention increasingly turned toward the structure of law itself, recognizing that without reform of legal institutions, the victories of satire and public opinion would remain fragile. He examined the French judicial system and saw fragmentation. Provinces governed by inconsistent codes, torture sanctioned as instrument of confession, verdicts influenced by status and confession rather than evidence. And he concluded that injustice persisted not merely because of malicious individuals, but because procedures permitted cruelty under guise of order. The law, in his view, should function as shield for the vulnerable rather than sword for the powerful. Yet too often it mirrored hierarchy rather than fairness. He argued that punishment must follow transparent standards, that evidence should outweigh prejudice, that confessional identity must not predetermine guilt. These principles drawn not from abstract utopianism, but from cases he had witnessed and contested. The Calas affair among them, reinforcing conviction that arbitrary authority thrives in ambiguity. When rules remain opaque, citizens cannot anticipate consequences, and fear replaces trust. A stable society requires predictability. A citizen should know rights and limits clearly rather than navigate rumor and favoritism. Voltaire did not advocate immediate abolition of monarchy. He remained wary of chaotic upheaval. Yet he insisted that sovereignty without accountability degrades into banditry cloaked in ceremony. He supported a concept of rational contract between ruler and ruled, echoing lessons from England, where law constrained even the crown. He admired systems where taxation faced scrutiny, where debate preceded decree, and contrasted them with extravagance of Versailles sustained by burdens borne disproportionately by peasants. Economic injustice intertwined with political imbalance, and he emphasized that hunger undermines liberty. A population struggling for subsistence cannot cultivate informed judgment. In pamphlets and correspondence, he pressed for abolition of torture, condemning the breaking wheel and other brutal methods as relics of medieval mentality incompatible with reason. He argued that extracting confession through pain contaminates truth itself, producing statements shaped by desperation rather than fact, and that justice dependent on suffering erodes moral legitimacy. His critiques resonated gradually among reform-minded jurists who recognized the necessity of modernization. And though change unfolded slowly, seeds of procedural reform began to take root. The law for Voltaire was not abstract code, but but living instrument. Shaping daily life, he envisioned standardized statutes replacing patchwork customs, secular courts prioritizing evidence over dogma, appeals, processes guarding against irreversible error. These were incremental aspirations, yet revolutionary in implication, because they shifted authority from inherited sanctity to rational justification. A judge required reason, not revelation, to justify verdict. He also linked freedom of expression to legal integrity, insisting that speech should not invite imprisonment absent incitement to harm, recalling his own confinement in the Bastille as emblem of arbitrary suppression. And through persistent advocacy, he reinforced the idea that state legitimacy strengthens. When dissent is tolerated rather than crushed, stability grounded in fear proves brittle, whereas stability grounded in consent proves resilient. In challenging both church courts and royal prerogatives, he walked a delicate path, aware that excessive provocation could reignite repression, yet he persisted, balancing critique with calculated respect, appealing to rulers' desire for enlightened reputation while pressing them toward reform. Diplomacy intertwined with defiance, illustrating his mature strategy of influence. Ultimately, his campaign for legal rationalization contributed to intellectual climate that would later inform revolutionary declarations. Even if he himself did not endorse violent rupture, his insistence that law serve humanity rather than dominate. It redefined expectations of governance, transforming subjects into citizens in conception before practice. And in advancing this vision, he completed arc begun in youthful resistance, replacing instinctive refusal to kneel with structured demand that authority justify itself through transparent and humane procedure. By the later decades of his life, Voltaire understood something that many thinkers before him had not fully grasped: that ideas alone do not travel. They require identity, image, narrative. And he consciously shaped his public persona into symbol of enlightenment itself. Portraits circulated across Europe depicting him thin, alert, slightly smiling, often holding a pen or manuscript, the frailty of his body contrasting with intensity of his gaze. This visual language reinforced a message. Intellect outlives force. Thought endures where armor decays. And Voltaire did not resist this symbolism. He curated it, aware that in a culture long accustomed to venerating saints and monarchs, the Enlightenment required its own icon. At Ferney, visitors encountered not a recluse withdrawn from society, but a carefully staged presence. A host who understood theatricality, greeting diplomats and young admirers with controlled wit, recounting episodes of prison and exile as narrative capital, transforming personal struggle into legend that amplified authority. He corresponded strategically with artists and publishers, ensuring that engravings, busts, and collected editions of his works reinforced coherence between message and image. The Hermit of Ferney became recognizable brand, shorthand for tolerance, skepticism, and cultivated defiance. This self-awareness did not signal vanity alone, but tactical foresight. Reputation functioned as armor. The more widely admired he became, the more costly it was for authorities to silence him. Public affection translated into political caution. And Voltaire leveraged celebrity with precision, accepting honors selectively, praising rulers when it advanced reform, distancing himself when association threatened credibility. He balanced proximity to power with independence from it, maintaining ambiguity that preserved influence across factions. The branding extended to tone of his writing, concise, memorable phrases that lingered beyond immediate context, aphorisms that readers could quote in conversation, reinforcing his presence even when absent, he understood rhythm of memory, that brevity often outlives complexity. And through disciplined repetition of themes, tolerance, reason, legal reform, he embedded association between his name and those principles. Constructing intellectual legacy while still alive, critics accused him of cultivating myth, of exaggerating persecution for dramatic effect, yet even these accusations fed narrative of controversial thinker challenging establishment. Opposition strengthened recognition, and Voltaire rarely allowed himself to appear defeated. Setbacks reframed as evidence of resilience. Controversies converted into publicity. He anticipated modern dynamics of reputation management centuries before media saturation, demonstrating that control of story often determines survival of ideas. At the same time, branding imposed burden, expectation to embody rational clarity, to respond swiftly to injustice, to maintain sharpness despite advancing age and chronic illness. And he navigated this tension with discipline, aware that symbolic status magnified both triumph and misstep. He moderated extremes, avoided association with violent agitation, preserving image as elder statesman rather than incendiary radical, positioning himself as conscience rather than commander. Through careful cultivation of persona, he ensured that Enlightenment principles acquired human face, accessible and recognizable, replacing abstract philosophy with living example. And when younger generations encountered his works, they did so already primed by image of determined yet urbane critic. Making reception more immediate, his legacy thus entwined with identity he engineered, demonstrating that in struggle between authority and inquiry, narrative can be weapon as decisive as argument. By the time he approached final years, Voltaire was not merely writer but emblem, embodiment of intellectual resistance that transcended individual publications. And in mastering art of self-presentation, he secured durability for his ideas beyond fluctuations of political climate, proving that to challenge entrenched systems effectively, one must not only speak truth, but also shape how that truth is perceived, remembered, and carried forward. As Voltaire's reputation solidified within Europe, his influence began extending far beyond the borders of France and Prussia. Carried not by armies or trade fleets, but by letters, translations, and reputation that preceded his name into distant courts and emerging republics. Among the most significant of these connections was his correspondence with Catherine the Great of Russia, a ruler eager to align herself with Enlightenment ideals while consolidating imperial authority. She admired French culture, read his works attentively, and sought his approval as validation of her modernizing ambitions, and Voltaire responded with strategic encouragement, praising reforms in education and legal codification, urging tolerance and rational administration, yet always conscious that sovereign flattery could conceal autocratic continuity. He walked careful line between inspiration and complicity, offering intellectual endorsement while maintaining critical distance, understanding that proximity to power must not erode principle. His letters to Catherine reveal both optimism and restraint, optimism that Enlightenment might penetrate even vast empires resistant to internal reform, restraint born of earlier disillusionment with Frederick. He had learned that rulers embrace philosophy selectively, adopting language of progress while guarding authority. And so his tone blended admiration with subtle reminders that true legitimacy requires justice and protection of conscience. Even as he celebrated educational initiatives, he hinted that durable greatness rests on humane governance rather than territorial expansion. Across the Atlantic, his ideas found fertile ground among American thinkers shaping their own experiment in constitutional government. Benjamin Franklin visited him in Paris during Voltaire's final months, a symbolic meeting of old and new enlightenment. And though their interaction was brief, it represented continuity between critique of European absolutism and construction of republican institutions in the colonies. Thomas Jefferson and other founders read his works, absorbing defense of religious liberty and separation between civil authority and ecclesiastical dominance. And while American revolutionaries drew from multiple intellectual sources, Voltaire's persistent insistence on freedom of expression and rational inquiry resonated strongly within their debates. His skepticism taught clerical power reinforcing argument that states should not privilege particular confession. Translations of his work circulated in German states, Italian cities, and even in parts of Eastern Europe where censorship sought to contain them, demonstrating that intellectual contagion rarely respects borders. His critiques of fanaticism appealed not only to Catholics or Protestants, but to anyone wary of dogmatic imposition. And in highlighting wisdom of non-European civilizations, he subtly challenged Eurocentric arrogance, referencing Chinese administrative systems and Indian philosophy as evidence that morality and governance need not conform to singular tradition. This comparative approach broadened enlightenment beyond narrow nationalism, framing reason as universal capacity rather than regional privilege, yet global reach also amplified contradictions. Some critics noted his financial investments tied indirectly to colonial trade, complicating image a pure humanitarian reformer. And this tension reflected broader Enlightenment paradox, ideals of liberty coexisting with economic structures built on exploitation. Voltaire did not fully resolve these contradictions, but their presence underscores complexity of intellectual history, progress emerging unevenly within imperfect contexts. Still, his overarching impact remained transformative. By modeling correspondence that crossed languages and sovereignties, he reinforced concept that ideas form networks more resilient than regimes. That conversation between distant minds can shape governance without direct confrontation. The Republic of Letters expanded into proto-global discourse, anticipating later movements for human rights and secular law. And in this expansion, Voltaire's voice functioned less as solitary authority and more as catalyst, encouraging others to articulate reform within their own cultural frameworks. As his life approached its conclusion, he could observe traces of influence radiating outward. From Russian legal debates to American constitutional drafts, from German philosophical dialogues to French judicial reconsiderations. And while he never claimed singular authorship of modern liberty, his persistent advocacy helped normalize skepticism toward inherited power, making dissent respectable. And in doing so, he contributed to gradual reorientation of political imagination, demonstrating that a writer stationed at rural border could influence capitals across oceans, that geography constrains bodies but not arguments, and that when ideas align with human desire for dignity, they travel farther than their originator ever could. By the time revolutionary tensions intensified in the American colonies, Voltaire had become elder figure of European Enlightenment. And though he never witnessed the full unfolding of the American Revolution, he sensed in its early stirrings confirmation that ideas, once confined to salons, could crystallize into constitutional experiment, correspondence between European intellectuals and colonial leaders carried debates about representation, taxation, and religious liberty across the Atlantic. And within those exchanges, Voltaire's persistent critique of clerical dominance and arbitrary authority found resonance. His insistence that conscience belongs to individual rather than institution, aligning naturally with colonial arguments. Against imposed governance, the meeting between Voltaire and Benjamin Franklin in Paris during 1778 symbolized this bridge between continents. The aging philosopher, frail yet alert, the American diplomat, pragmatic yet philosophically informed, their embrace witnessed by observers who interpreted it as convergence of thought and action. And when Voltaire blessed Franklin's grandson, invoking God and liberty, he articulated in brief phrase synthesis he had long pursued. A deistic acknowledgement of rational creator coupled with unwavering commitment to civil freedom. This moment carried theatrical power, yet also intellectual continuity. Enlightenment skepticism flowing into Republican structure. American thinkers did not adopt his ideas wholesale. They blended them with British constitutional tradition and their own colonial experiences. Yet Voltaire's defense of free expression and religious tolerance reinforced emerging consensus that state must not enforce doctrinal conformity. And his analysis of judicial injustice echoed in demands for fair trial and due process principles. Later enshrined in foundational documents, the Atlantic thus became conduit rather than barrier. Ideas migrating from critique of European absolutism into blueprint for new governance model. Voltaire observed developments with cautious optimism, aware that revolutions often unleash forces beyond initial intention. He admired challenge too. Hereditary monarchy yet remained wary of excess zeal. His skepticism toward concentrated passion tempered celebration. And though he did not live to witness full consolidation of American Republic, he perceived within it validation of long argument. That legitimacy derives from consent, that freedom of conscience stabilizes rather than destabilizes society. That law grounded in evidence and accountability surpasses decrees grounded in tradition alone. The American bridge, therefore, represented more than diplomatic exchange. It embodied transformation of enlightenment from intellectual movement into political architecture, demonstrating that discourse can precede institution, that pamphlets and letters prepare ground for constitutions, and that a writer's insistence on questioning authority can echo in drafting rooms oceans away. Voltaire's role in this process was neither solitary nor exclusive, yet his influence contributed to climate where separation of church and state, protection of speech, and suspicion of unchecked power became viable rather than radical propositions. In witnessing these transatlantic developments, Voltaire glimpsed possibility that his life's work extended beyond French reform into global reconfiguration of political imagination, that seeds planted in critique of the Bastille might bloom within representative assemblies abroad. And this awareness offered measure of vindication, evidence that laughter, analysis, and persistence could converge into institutional reality, even if imperfect, even if incomplete. The American experiment stood as testament that enlightenment need not remain confined to discourse. It could cross oceans and assume durable form, linking continents in shared aspiration toward liberty anchored in reason. By 1778, Voltaire was 83 years old, his body fragile, his movements measured, yet his reputation more formidable than ever. And after nearly 3 decades at Ferney, he resolved to return to Paris. The city that had once imprisoned him, censored him, and forced him into exile. This decision was not casual nostalgia, but psychological culmination. A final act in life shaped by confrontation with authority. He understood the risk to his health, Friends warned that travel could prove fatal. But he also sensed that history was shifting, that the intellectual climate of France had changed enough to permit his presence not as suspect, but as celebrated figure. The journey from Ferney to Paris unfolded like slow procession. Crowds gathering along roads to glimpse the man whose writings had circulated through decades of controversy. And as his carriage approached the capital, anticipation intensified. Salons prepared receptions, academies arranged meetings. Admirers competed for access. The once dangerous satirist, now welcomed as patriarch of enlightenment. And this reversal revealed transformation within French society. Reverence migrating from throne toward intellect. From inherited authority toward earned influence. When he entered Paris, the reaction bordered on reverential spectacle. Citizens lining streets, cheering, calling his name. Not as monarch, but as moral symbol. And within this acclaim lay quiet irony. The state that had confined him now tolerated his triumphal reception, signaling erosion of unquestioned absolutism. Voltaire attended sessions of the Academy of Sciences, met philosophers and diplomats, conversed with American envoys, including Franklin, and each encounter reinforced sense that his life's work had transcended personal grievance to become collective aspiration. The pinnacle of this return occurred at the Comédie Française during performance of his final tragedy, Iran. The audience rising in prolonged ovation, placing laurel wreath upon his head, presenting marble bust adorned as if honoring secular saint. And as applause echoed through theater, the symbolism was unmistakable. A writer receiving honors once reserved for warriors and kings. Intellectual authority publicly celebrated. Superstition yielding space to reason within cultural imagination. And though Voltaire maintained composure, the emotional weight was visible. A recognition that exile had culminated in acknowledgement. Yet beneath celebration lingered tension. Clergy uneasy with his prominence, conservatives wary of influence, and his health deteriorated rapidly under strain of constant visitation and ceremony. The body weakened even as legend strengthened, illustrating paradox of mortality and memory. He had returned not merely to bask in admiration, but to confirm that intellectual defiance could outlast repression. And in that confirmation he found closure. The final return thus served as bridge between personal odyssey and impending revolution. A symbolic transfer from solitary critic to public consciousness, prepared for transformation. Voltaire did not orchestrate events that would erupt 11 years later. Yet his presence in Paris in 1778 felt like prologue, as if city acknowledged debt before storm gathered. And when he lay ill in his final days, surrounded by admirers and anxious clergy seeking recantation, he remained consistent, refusing to surrender autonomy of thought even at threshold of death. The journey back to Paris' completed arc begun in youth when he first sensed tension between obedience and conscience. And as crowds celebrated him, he could perceive that laughter once deemed subversive had become accepted instrument of critique. That doubt once punished had matured into shared language. And though he would not live to see full dismantling of Ancien regime, his final return confirmed that architecture of reverence had already cracked. That authority now required justification rather than mere inheritance. And in that recognition, his life's narrative found resolution, exile transformed into triumph, resistance into recognition, doubt into legacy. In the spring of 1778, the intensity of celebration gave way to physical collapse. Voltaire weakened under strain of constant visitors, conversations, ceremonies, and at 83 his body could no longer sustain the pace demanded by public adoration. Illness confined him to bed, yet even in frailty his presence carried symbolic weight. Clergy, aware of his lifelong critique of ecclesiastical authority, approached with urgency, hoping to secure final confession that might soften legacy. A deathbed reconciliation that could be framed as victory for the church he had challenged for decades. But Voltaire remained lucid, cautious, unwilling to provide statement that could be interpreted as surrender of intellectual independence. Accounts from those present described measured responses, evasive rather than confrontational, humor flickering even through weakness, preserving autonomy without dramatic spectacle. He understood power of narrative and refused to grant opponents triumph of public recantation, and on May 30th, 1778, he died quietly in Paris. Not amid thunderous proclamation, but subdued vigil. Yet conflict did not end with final breath. It shifted toward question of burial. Ecclesiastical authorities reluctant to permit honorable interment within city, intending instead to deny ceremonial dignity as final gesture of disapproval. Friends and relatives recognized that allowing such treatment would diminish symbolic victory achieved through his return, and so they acted with discretion and speed, dressing his body, placing it upright within carriage as if still living passenger, transporting it out of Paris under cover of routine travel before official prohibition could be enforced. This clandestine departure mirrored episodes from his life, maneuvering around authority through ingenuity rather than direct confrontation, and he was buried at the Abbey of Cirey in Champagne, interred quietly yet respectfully, beyond immediate reach of those who wished to obscure his memory. The smuggling of his remains underscored paradox that had defined his career. Celebrated by crowds, yet contested by institutions. Admired as champion of reason, yet denied conventional honors by guardians of orthodoxy. Even in death, he occupied liminal space between acceptance and resistance. His physical absence contrasting with enduring presence of his writings circulating widely, and as news spread, reactions varied from reverence to relief, but indifference was rare. He had ensured that neutrality toward his influence was nearly impossible. In the years following his burial, France edged closer to upheaval. Economic strain, political tension, intellectual ferment converging into revolutionary crises. And within that environment, Voltaire's critiques acquired renewed relevance. His arguments against arbitrary justice and religious persecution echoing in assemblies debating reform. And in 1791, amid fervor of revolution, the National Assembly resolved to bring his remains back to Paris in grand ceremony, recognizing him as precursor to their own aspirations. Exhumation, transforming secret burial into public apotheosis. Coffin carried through streets by immense procession, thousands accompanying the cortege, banners proclaiming him benefactor of humanity. Thus the man once imprisoned for satire entered the pantheon as national hero, his tomb placed prominently. Inscription acknowledging that he contested the powerful and advanced human reason. And in this final relocation, his narrative achieved symbolic closure. From Bastille prisoner to honored patriarch of republic, the arc illustrating transformation not only of one individual's fortunes but of cultural values themselves. Reverence redirected from inherited sanctity toward intellectual courage, and though controversies around his thought persisted, his burial within temple of civic memory confirmed that struggle he embodied had reshaped collective consciousness. The death and the smuggling, therefore, encapsulate Voltaire's life in miniature. Tension between suppression and survival, authority and ingenuity, condemnation and celebration. demonstrating that ideas once deemed dangerous can become foundational when persistence outlasts resistance. And in resting within the pantheon, he remained positioned not as flawless saint, but as enduring reminder that questioning power carries cost, yet also carries capacity to redefine what societies choose to honor. When Voltaire's remains were transferred to the Pantheon in 1791, the ceremony was not merely funeral procession, but political declaration. The revolutionaries who carried his coffin through Paris understood symbolism they were staging. This was the man who had challenged the Bastille long before it fell, who had mocked sanctified injustice before it collapsed under its own contradictions. And as crowds gathered in overwhelming numbers to witness the spectacle, they were not only honoring memory, they were affirming lineage, linking their upheaval to decades of intellectual erosion that had weakened the foundations of absolute monarchy and clerical dominance. The procession moved deliberately, banners raised, speeches delivered, his coffin placed upon monumental chariot designed to emphasize grandeur. And when it entered the Pantheon, the transformation was complete. A writer once denied burial in Paris, now enshrined at center of national memory, his tomb facing that of Rousseau in silent juxtaposition, to rival visions of modernity sharing eternal proximity, reason and sentiment, moderation and fervor, both woven into fabric of revolutionary identity. Yet Voltaire's ghost within the Pantheon carries complexity rather than simplicity. He did not design the revolution that canonized him. He did not advocate violent purges or radical leveling. And during the Reign of Terror, his warnings about fanaticism echoed uncomfortably as revolutionary zeal hardened into dogma, reminding observers that skepticism must apply even to movements born from noble aspiration. His legacy thus resists appropriation by single faction. He remains champion of tolerance, yet critic of excess, advocate of reform, yet wary of uncontrolled upheaval. Across centuries, his influence has endured not through uniform agreement, but through persistent relevance. In debates over freedom of speech, his arguments surface repeatedly. In struggles against religious persecution, his campaigns for Calas and others provide precedent. In discussions of secular governance, his deism offers middle ground between rigid orthodoxy and nihilistic denial. And in defense of legal transparency, his critiques of torture resonate within modern human rights frameworks. His ghost lingers not as relic, but as question, challenging each generation to examine whether institutions justify themselves through reason or merely demand obedience. The Pantheon itself symbolizes transition from sacred to civic reverence, a former church transformed into temple of national heroes. And Voltaire's presence there underscores broader shift he helped catalyze, authority migrating from divine sanction toward human deliberation. And though no society fully embodies ideals he articulated, aspiration persists, woven into constitutions, courts, universities, public discourse, wherever individuals insist that ideas must withstand scrutiny. His garden at Ferney may no longer function as living experiment. The kings he sparred with reduced to historical chapters, yet the principles he refined continue circulating. Laughter directed at arrogance, skepticism toward unchecked power, commitment to tolerance over persecution. These patterns recur wherever citizens resist silence imposed by fear, and thus his ghost in the Pantheon is less monument than mirror, reflecting ongoing struggle between reverence and reason. The odyssey that began with boy observing hierarchy in notary's house concludes not in marble alone, but in enduring tension within modern societies. Tension between authorities seeking compliance and minds insisting on inquiry. And Voltaire's life demonstrates that progress rarely emerges from a single moment of revolt. It develops through persistent questioning, strategic engagement, disciplined argument, and courage to endure consequence without surrendering thought. As long as speech remains contested, as long as law risks bending toward prejudice, as long as belief tempts coercion, his presence endures, not as untouchable saint, but as a reminder that dignity of mind requires defense. And in the quiet crypt beneath Paris, his tomb stands as testament that laughter once punished can become foundation of liberty. That doubt once feared can illuminate path toward justice. And that the war for light continues wherever individuals refuse to kneel before unexamined power. As we leave the silence of the Pantheon and step back into the noise of our own century, Voltaire no longer feels distant, he feels immediate, because the questions he asked are not buried in the 18th century. They are alive wherever authority demands reverence without explanation, wherever belief attempts to silence inquiry, wherever law forgets that it exists to protect rather than intimidate. He taught us that doubt is not destruction. It is discipline, that laughter is not disrespect. It is resistance, and that freedom of thought is not a luxury granted by rulers, but a responsibility carried by citizens. He was not perfect, not immune to contradiction, not free from the limitations of his era, yet he understood something timeless, that the mind must remain sovereign, that ideas must survive examination, and that progress begins the moment we refuse to kneel before inherited certainty. The garden he spoke of was never only land at Ferney, it was the world itself, and cultivation meant effort, patience, courage, work done quietly even when applause fades. If this odyssey moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you reconsider what power truly depends on, then carry the conversation forward. Share this story with someone who values freedom of thought. Subscribe to remain part of this ongoing exploration of history's most dangerous ideas. And in the comments below, reflect on this question. In a world where speech can still carry consequence, would you choose comfort or conviction, silence or scrutiny? Because the Enlightenment did not end in 1778. It continues wherever someone decides that truth deserves a voice. The candle is still burning, the garden is still waiting, and the next chapter of reason begins with you.